They potentially have only 36 hours of air left. As the clock ticks down, rescuers are desperately searching for the submarine lost somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean.
Our crews are working around the clock to ensure that we are doing everything possible to locate the Titan and the 5 crew members. To date, those search efforts have not yielded any results.
There are still so few clues as to the fate of the vessel and the men within it. We will try to assess tonight the various possibilities, and we'll talk to Robert Moore in Washington, who wrote a best-selling book about the loss of the Russian Kursk submarine. Also on News at 10. After her arrest, Nicola Sturgeon insists she is not guilty, but says she cannot speak for her husband. Where was Piers Morgan? The hacking judge says he was surprised not to hear from the former Mirror editor, amongst others. A scorching heat wave in northern India, where the hospitals and mortuaries are packed with the victims, and
Cummings will come back for 2. Oh, he's knocked it over the boundary edge, and Australia are home.
So close and yet so far. England don't quite make it home in the first test, but it was one hell of a game.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. If any warning was needed about just how much peril the 5 men on board the missing submarine are in, it came from the US Coast Guard. Earlier this evening, they said there was only enough oxygen for 40 hours, 36 hours from now. In other words, enough to last until 10 o'clock British time on Thursday morning. 3 of the 5 who haven't been heard from since they descended towards the wreck of the Titanic on Sunday are British. It isn't for want of trying that no sign of them has been found. The Coast Guard said planes, boats, and indeed another mini-submarine were searching above and below the surface of the North Atlantic, nearly 400 miles from land.
OceanGate Expeditions offers you the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
This is what the extraordinary mission aboard the Titan submersible should have been.
This is not a thrill ride for tourists. It's much more.
A crew of explorers on board a tiny vessel venturing into the ocean's abyss to view the deteriorating ruin of the Titanic.
There's truly nothing else like it.
But it is in these deep, dark waters that it has vanished, prompting planes from America and Canada to be deployed in the search for it, and the Pentagon to commit yet more help.
So by the end of today, we would have committed 3 C-130s to conducting search and rescue flights. In addition to that, the Navy has been in touch with the Coast Guard and is working to provide personnel, such as subject matter experts, and assets as quickly as possible.
They are scouring the surface and the seas using sonar for signs of the craft's failed mission, which began on Friday when the crew set off from St. John's in Newfoundland, Canada, towards the shipwreck site. That's a distance of roughly 370 miles. On Sunday morning, the submersible began its descent towards the Titanic, which lies at a depth of 3,800 meters. Just 1 hour and 45 minutes into that dive, all communication was lost with the explorers on board.
I love adventure. I've been lucky enough to get opportunities in my life to do adventurous things.
Explorers like the British billionaire Hamish Harding, a man who's been to space and circumnavigated the globe before.
Hamish will definitely be an important asset to the team. I have no doubt that he will be calm and collected. I really believe that Hamish is the one who can also help lead this team because he has been in tricky situations in the past on expeditions.
Alongside Hamish is the British businessman Shahzaza Dawood and his 19-year-old son Solomon on their very first exploration.
Oh! Take your shoes off, that's customary, okay?
They are all in this small, confined space with a French pilot and the owner of the company who made this vessel, inside which there is now less than 40 hours of oxygen left.
Our crews are working around the clock to ensure that we are doing everything possible to locate the Titan and the 5 crew members. To date, those search efforts have not yielded any results.
But at the depths this vessel can reach, the seas can be deadly, and time is running out to find it. Lucy Watson, News at 10, Boston.
Has to be said, the idea of being trapped down beneath the ocean in that small thing is horrific, and there are so many uncertainties involved in the rescue operation. If locating the submarine seems difficult enough, reaching it and recovering it will be even harder. And John is here to take us through what the rescue teams are up against. John.
Tom, it is, as we've been hearing, an absolutely vast search area, something like the size of Wales, and that's just on the surface of the Atlantic. Rescuers are trying to do something never done before, and that is to scour an ocean so deep it could swallow 13 buildings the height of London's Shard, stacked one on top of the other. And the deeper you go, of course, the harder it gets. Even blue whales can only dive to a maximum 500 metres. Beyond 750 metres, and you enter the danger zone for military submarines, after which their hulls might implode under pressure. At 1,000 metres, there's no sunlight. It's pitch black. And remember, the Titanic is down at 3,800 metres on the seabed, where the pressure of water is a crushing 378 times greater than on the surface. In short, it is cold, it is dark and deadly. Now, the most famous wreck in the world is split into two. The bow, still recognisable after a century on the ocean floor, lies 600 metres from the ruins of the stern. So they're looking for a submersible that is just 7 metres long in a debris field that is the equivalent of 1,000 football pitches. And that's assuming, of course, it is indeed on the seabed. Now, history gives us one successful outcome of a similar search. Back in 1973, 2 British engineers were rescued from their submersible 150 miles off the coast of Ireland, but they were trapped at a depth of less than 500 metres. Still, the rescue took more than 3 days, and when they eventually came to the surface, they had just a few minutes oxygen left. So time is against the Titan. Let's hope, Tom, that luck is on their side.
OK, John, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining us now from Washington is our correspondent, Robert Moore, and Lucy is at Search HQ in Boston. Robert, maybe we can come to you first. As I said at the start, you obviously reported on the sinking of the Russian Kursk submarine in 2000 and went on to write a best-selling book about it. What are your thoughts at this point in the search?
Well, Tom, I think sort of submarine and underwater rescues are extraordinarily challenging, even in favourable circumstances. The Kursk submarine sank in August 2000 in the Barents Sea, and it sank in remarkably shallow waters of just 100 metres. And yet, for the 23 survivors who survived the initial explosions, they were huddled in the aft of the submarine. They were able to generate additional oxygen. But even then, Russian and then Western rescuers could not reach them in time, and they died in the submarine. The Titan, as John has been explaining, is not at 100 metres, but at 4,000 metres, almost certainly on the seabed. And that is a depth that is way out of reach of even the best of the US Navy's rescue submersibles. And even if the Titan can be located on the seabed, it is not at all clear, technically speaking, how that submersible would be brought to the surface. So, Tom, overall, my impression is that these 5 men are in desperate trouble, but it is also true to say that it's in the DNA of the Coast Guards, the militaries, of the submarine rescue community to throw everything at this problem. You know, it's a matter of pride, but also of seafaring tradition to try and save these men, irrespective of the overwhelming odds that face them tonight.
OK, Robert, thank you very much. Well, Lucy, I mean, you know, as Robert says, it's a pretty desperate situation. I mean, what do we know about the latest on the search?
Well, at this point here this evening, Tom, more than 7,600 square metres of ocean, both above and below the surface, has now been scoured. Aircraft using sonar equipment, boats and also remotely operated submersibles are all being used in this operation. Just a few hours ago, the Pentagon promised to commit more US Navy aircraft to this operation and also people to help out, their own personnel. There have also been offers of assistance from the governments in Britain and also in France. This is a story, this is a maritime mystery that has garnered international attention and interest, and therefore it has become an international search operation. But there is a grim deadline fast approaching, and that deadline, of course, as you mentioned earlier, there is just around 36 hours left of oxygen in that vessel to survive on. That is an extremely grim deadline in an increasingly dire and frantic search now, Tom.
OK, Lucy, well, despite everything, we'll keep our fingers crossed for better news tomorrow. Now, back here, 9 days on from her arrest and release, it was back to work today for Nicola Sturgeon, insisting she had done nothing wrong. She would not be drawn on the position of her husband, saying she could only speak for herself, though no one should read anything into that. Miss Sturgeon was returning to the Scottish Parliament as a backbencher, of course, for the first time since she was questioned by police investigating SNP funding.
Back to work for the first time since being arrested and back in front of the cameras.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along.
She spent 7 hours in a police station before being released without charge, questioned as a suspect in an investigation that is ongoing.
I respect and fully understand the process that is underway, but I am absolutely certain that I have done nothing wrong.
This investigation relates to money fundraised for a future independence referendum. Nicola Sturgeon's home was searched. Her husband, the former SNP chief executive, was arrested, as was the party's former treasurer. Both were released without charge pending further investigation, and today she was asked if they too are innocent.
I can only speak for myself in these matters. I'm here speaking for myself, and as I have done previously, expressing again my certainty that I have done nothing wrong.
Upon resigning as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon told ITV News she would not be a distraction from the backbenches.
But even your presence there.
Yeah, I know that, and that's something I'll have to work out, and because the last thing I want to do is be unhelpful to whoever comes after me.
Now some in her own party say this ongoing drama is not helpful.
Is there a part of you that thinks that this circus now surrounding you, partly you're engaging with, is now becoming unhelpful to Hamza Yusuf?
But Peter, you've characterised that question there that suggests that I am somehow choosing to stand before you right now.
Are you not? Do you not have to?
I am choosing to do it because I couldn't have come here to Parliament and gone about my job. Because I have a job to do on behalf of my constituents.
Is there a part of you that's worried that you're not letting Hamza Yusuf do his job?
I think Hamza Yusuf, well, Hamza can and is very able to speak for himself.
But SNP colleagues were not speaking up today.
Angela Constance, is Nicola Sturgeon a distraction for the SNP? Is Nicola Sturgeon a distraction?
Opposition parties were less tight-lipped on their criticism.
Nicola Sturgeon would have suspended Nicola Sturgeon, but Hamza Yusuf is not strong enough to do so because he owes his job to Nicola Sturgeon.
It's not clear to me why Nicola Sturgeon thinks this was necessary today to come here and impromptu press conferences in the corridor when the Parliament is discussing drugs deaths, and instead of doing that, this is what we're talking about.
Nicola Sturgeon is clear she is not going to shy away. And so long after she left the top job, she continues to dominate the discourse in Scottish politics. Peter Smith, News at 10, Edinburgh.
There was an interesting comment about Piers Morgan today from the judge in the Prince Harry phone hacking case. As the evidence drew to a close in the claims against Mirror Group newspapers, Mr Justice Fancourt listed more than 24 names who he said perhaps could and should have given evidence. Mr Morgan was one of them. Rebecca has again been following the case, as she has, what is it, 6 weeks now? You've been inside and outside the court. What do you make of these comments today, and as we indeed come to the end of the case as a whole?
Well, over that 6 weeks in that courtroom, we've heard from royalty, soap stars, private investigators, journalists, and today we heard from the final witnesses. But it was the absence of some that the judge chose to draw attention to. He questioned whether a number of Mirror Group journalists, including the former Mirror editor Piers Morgan, could and should have given evidence. He said that Piers Morgan has had a good deal to comment on outside of the courtroom. Perhaps he was alluding to some of the comments that Piers Morgan has made to us in recent weeks, and we can take a look at those.
I'm not going to take lectures on privacy invasion from Prince Harry, somebody who spent the last 3 years ruthlessly and cynically invading the royal family's privacy for vast commercial gain.
He's perfectly entitled to his opinions, and I will be perfectly entitled to have mine.
Well, during this trial, the court has heard that Piers Morgan lies at the heart of these phone hacking allegations against Mirror Group newspapers, something that Piers Morgan has repeatedly denied, including under oath at the Leveson inquiry. Now, of course, we don't yet know the outcome of this civil trial, but giving wrong evidence to a public inquiry like Leveson is a criminal offence. Next week, the judge will hear the closing arguments. Then he'll go off and make his way through the very many mountains of court documents he has to go through before giving his final ruling at some point later this year.
OK, Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. Now, once famous for his kickboxing, more recently for spouting misogynistic messages on social media, now Andrew Tate has been formally charged in Romania with sex crimes. He and his brother Tristan are accused of rape, human trafficking and setting up a criminal gang to exploit women. He responded where else but on Twitter, suggesting the Romanian authorities were after his wealth. Now, a consensus seems to be emerging from the COVID inquiry that there was indeed insufficient planning for a pandemic. The former Chancellor, George Osborne, said no one had prepared for a lockdown when he was in office. England's former Chief Medical Officer, Dame Sally Davies, similarly told the inquiry no one had foreseen a lockdown. Dame Sally struggled somewhat to contain her feelings as she said sorry to bereaved families for the deaths of their loved ones and indeed for the horrible way they died.
As it dawned that COVID-19 was coming, from China to Italy to Britain, it also became clear that our response would be dramatic.
I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
But despite the impact shutting down our economy would have, a former Chancellor today admitted we totally failed to prepare.
The truth is we didn't plan for a lockdown. No Treasury did. Before me, after me.
He asked whether we would have locked down if China had not done so and said the inquiry must examine these difficult questions.
Should the schools have been locked down in the way they were? Absolutely critical questions about balancing, the life expectancy of an 80-year-old versus the educational opportunities of an 8-year-old.
Then the inquiry legal team looked further back in time to Mr. Osborne's flagship policy.
We need to tackle the deficit.
Do you agree, Mr. Osborne, that by the time that COVID-19 hit, the consequences of austerity were a depleted health and social care capacity and rising inequality in the United Kingdom?
Most certainly not. I completely reject that. I would say if we had not done that, Britain would have been more exposed.
I'm all yours now. But later we heard from the former Chief Medical Officer who told the inquiry we had fewer doctors, nurses and hospital beds per head than similar countries. After taking her seat, Dame Sally Davies also accepted that the lack of lockdown plan was a failure and apologised for what she got wrong.
Maybe this is the moment to say how sorry I am to the relatives who lost their families. It wasn't just the deaths, it was the way they died. It was horrible.
Intisar Chowdhury's dad, Abdul, a hospital doctor who had warned ministers about a lack of PPE, died of COVID early in the pandemic.
I don't think that the government was prepared. The only thing they can do now is be accountable, hold themselves accountable in the public eye, and just show some humility and empathy towards the bereaved families.
He hopes to see that humility when the Chancellor and former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt turns up at the inquiry tomorrow. Anushka Astana, News at 10.
Still to come on News at 10, a special investigation into the chicken from Poland dosed with antibiotics and sold in British supermarkets. And where does England's defeat in the first Ashes Test leave their new, thrilling style of play? That and more in just a few moments. Hello again. Anyone who buys certain breaded chicken at Asda, Iceland and Lidl could, we have discovered, be contributing to the spread of antibiotic resistant superbugs. Research we've done with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the Guardian newspaper shows that 3 supermarket groups use a chicken supplier in Poland that doses its poultry. That, in turn, is helping to build up resistance of the bugs.
These frozen chicken products fill the freezer aisles of Asda, Iceland and Lidl. The small print tells you it's all packaged and produced in Poland. What it does not tell you is that on these Polish farms, they are dosed with antibiotics, the same group of antibiotics used to treat human infection, which scientists warn is driving dangerous drug resistance.
We're staring down the barrel of a gun. We lose roughly 3 to 4 million lives every year due to antibiotic resistance. That's pretty much what COVID killed in the human population over a span of about 2 years. That's predicted to go somewhere between 20 and 30 million by 2050.
The company supplying the chicken is called Superdrop, a major European meat producer. We can now reveal that in 2020, Superdrop was the source of a major outbreak of antibiotic-resistant salmonella in the UK, which killed 5 people and infected at least 1,300 others. ITV News, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and The Guardian have obtained this letter from the UK's Chief Veterinary Officer from December 2020 to her Polish counterpart, confirming it was firmly linked to breaded chicken products from one specific company, Superdrop. 3 years on, we collected waste samples from poultry farms that supply Superdrop, and tests at the University of Oxford indicated the chickens are being given antibiotics. They tested positive for bacteria, including E. coli, resistant to the same group of antibiotics doctors use to treat humans.
It's really hugely troubling to hear of any antibiotics being used that are also really critically important antibiotics for treating human disease. We are losing the ability of those antibiotics to work on things like routine infections. You could end up dying of an infection from breaking a leg. You might not be able to have a caesarean section safely anymore in future, in a few decades' time.
So why is this potentially dangerous for us? Well, take a chicken. If it's raised in a factory farm, diseases like salmonella or E. coli can spread. So it's given antibiotics. By using the antibiotics, the chicken can develop bacteria resistant to the drug, which creates superbugs. We then eat that chicken and potentially catch that superbug. A doctor prescribes us antibiotics to treat it, but because the chicken we ate had become resistant to that antibiotic, so too now have we, meaning we can get very sick, and in some rare cases, even die.
Joanna, she was a bright, bubbly little girl. She was always full of fun, always playing football. She just enjoyed life.
In a separate incident, not linked to Superdrop chicken, 6-year-old Joanna Nash from West London became extremely unwell when she ate meat at a fast food restaurant containing superbug E. coli. Medics did everything they could, but she died 9 days later.
They couldn't treat her with antibiotics, but it affected her brain, her kidneys, every part of her body, and afterwards they couldn't use anything to donate because every part of her body had been affected.
The idea of antibiotic resistance has been known about for some considerable time. Ignoring it does not make the problem go away.
Last year, the EU banned the excessive use of antibiotics in poultry, but it's still legal to use them for exceptional treatment of individual chickens. Superdrop says antibiotics are used in their poultry, but only to treat disease when recommended by a vet. They deny breaking any rules.
And Daniel is here to talk about all this. Dan, this seems pretty worrying. What's being done about it?
Well, the widespread use of antibiotics is not just linked to Superdrop. It's done across the whole of agriculture in Poland and across Europe. And legally, it's kind of a grey area. It's illegal to do this excessively, preventatively. It's legal to do it if you have a sick animal, a sick chicken. And what Superdrop says is that that's what they do. They do this when there's a sick chicken, and they do it with the recommendation of a vet, and they've done nothing wrong here. On the we've revealed that they were the source of this outbreak in 2020, the company declined to comment. As for the supermarkets, well, Asda, Iceland and Lidl have all told us that they have the highest food safety standards, that they impose rigorous checks on the food they import, and that they promote the responsible use of antibiotics. Asda also encourages people to cook this stuff properly, because that's part of the problem. TGO Fridays refused to comment. The bigger problem, of course, here is antibiotic resistance in humans. It's coming down the track. It's set to kill as many people as kills cancer, die from cancer by 2050, and we sort of need to get on top of this pretty soon.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Now, there is a medical emergency gripping parts of India that has left hospitals overwhelmed and mortuaries filled to capacity. It has been caused by an unusually scorching heat wave. Nothing too surprising in the temperatures across much of the country, reaching 26 degrees yesterday. But what is worrying this early in the year is that in the dark areas here in the northeast, they have already topped 42 degrees. In two of the worst affected states, Uttar Pradesh and in Bihar, the heat is proving fatal.
Another patient with heat stroke is rushed into hospital. The wards are already overwhelmed with victims of the searing heat, but there's been no let-up in arrivals. Temperatures have remained above 43 degrees in recent days, and thousands have been seeking treatment for breathing difficulties and even organ failure due to the extreme conditions. This man cries out in agony. His father has just died on a hospital trolley in the corridor, waiting for help. It is also unbearably hot inside this hospital in Uttar Pradesh. The power keeps cutting out, leaving patients without air conditioning. This man points to the sunlight streaming in through the windows. He's laid a cloth over his relative to try to protect them. Others are desperately fanning their loved ones or trying to cool them down with wet cloths.
The cooler is not working properly despite the heat wave. It's a big problem for the patients. This heat stroke is all about heat, and there is no respite for the patients even inside the hospital. I can't think of a solution to this problem.
June is one of India's hottest months before the monsoon season hits. But the heat waves have become more intense, with prolonged periods of above average temperatures. This year it has been particularly severe in the heavily populated states of Uttar Pradesh and neighbouring Bihar. Nearly 170 deaths have been attributed to heat-related illnesses, but it's thought many more have died before reaching hospital and from conditions compounded by the heat. The government has held a crisis meeting to respond to the unprecedented situation. In the worst affected areas, help can't come soon enough.
All staff are working 24 hours a day to treat the patients. We are not resting even for a minute.
Climate change has made India more susceptible to heat waves, and every summer threatens to be more lethal than the last. Debbie Edward, News at 10.
The trial of former President Donald Trump on federal charges of deliberately withholding classified documents has been given an initial start date of August the 14th, just before the US presidential election. As you will know, the Justice Department has promised a speedy trial, but with 37 charges on the indictment and challenges likely, there could be lengthy delays. Finally, the first Ashes test of the new era of aggressive and entertaining England had everything. Two fired-up teams, each at the top of their game, and after 5 cracking days, cricket, a nail-biting, nerve-shredding finish. Just one thing was missing, of course, an England victory. In the end, Australia and Test cricket were the joint winners.
One of the great Test matches, shades of the classic from 2005 here, which England won. It could so easily have happened again on a day that swung back and forth. Boring, boring, Aussies sang the Barmy Army before the crowd exploded with joy as the wickets fell. Indecision. The thorn in England's side fell in a feverish atmosphere. Khawaja out for 65. You could cut the tension with a knife. Joe Root put England on course with a spectacular catch off his own bowling. The Aussies looked in trouble. Time for a captain's innings as Pat Cummins launched into 2 big sixes. But if catches win matches, Ben Stokes was this close to a huge moment. The Aussies would have been 9 down. Instead, opposite captain Cummins and Nathan Lyon saw Australia home by 2 wickets. What a game.
Pat, in all the Test match wins you've been a part of, where does that one rank? Is it number 1?
Number 1, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it was obviously very disappointing. It was an emotional roller coaster to be out in the middle there, especially being the person to have to make decisions. But, you know, I couldn't be more proud of the way in which we've operated from the start of this game, and especially, you know, the back end of today. You know, Ollie Robinson and Stuart Broad put an amazing shift in there to, you know, nearly get us over the line, but, you know, nearly doesn't win you anything.
Yes, so close, but Australia are not the World Test champions for nothing. And if England are to regain the Ashes they last won in 2015, they'll have to come out firing for the second Test at Lord's next week. Chris Scudder, News at 10, Edgbaston.
That's it. See you tomorrow. Good night and thanks for watching.